It's time for the news.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ahmed Attaf, has met on the occasion of his visit to Washington with high-level officials from the National Security Council at the White House and the U.S. State Department, according to a ministry press release. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has ordered the deployment of a standby force to restore constitutional order in Niger, which should be deployed as soon as possible, according to Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara. And the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has expressed his full support for the political process undertaken by the UN in Western Sahara during a meeting in Washington with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad. Those were the headlines, and now the news in detail from Radio Algeria International. First, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ahmed Attaf, has met on the occasion of his visit to Washington with high-level officials from the National Security Council at the White House and the U.S. State Department, according to a ministry press release. Ahmed Attaf met the coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa of the National Security Council at the White House, Brett McGurk. The two parties reviewed the latest developments in the situation in the Middle East, the Palestinian question, and the crisis in Libya in the context of the efforts being made by the United Nations to create the conditions necessary for the organization of a free and fair elections to put an end to the division. Ahmed Attaf also held talks with the Deputy Secretary of State, Derek Chollet, who is preparing to take up the post of Under Secretary of Defense, with whom he discussed developments in the crisis in Niger and ways and means of coordinating the two countries' efforts to strengthen the chances of a peaceful solution of the crisis in this neighboring brotherly country, the press release added. The Minister of Foreign Affairs also met the chairman of the U.S.-Algeria Parliamentary Friendship Group, member of the House of Representatives, Troy Nehls, with whom he reviewed the development of bilateral relations and the prospects for strengthening them. As part of his visit, Ahmed Attaf met representatives of the Algerian community settled in the United States, notes the same source. At the end of his working visit to Washington, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ahmed Attaf, met American economic operators and businessmen who are members of the Algerian American Business Council. On this occasion, the minister gave a detailed presentation to the participants in this meeting on the economic dynamic that Algeria is experiencing within the framework of the promising reforms initiated by the President of the Republic, reviewing the development indicators achieved by our country in recent years, which testify to a clear improvement in the economic and financial situation of our country. The magazine Al Jaish has asserted in its latest issue that the positive results achieved at all levels in recent years require more than ever before the consolidation of national cohesion and the strengthening of the internal front to complete the process of building the new Algeria. The positive results achieved at all levels and in all fields, despite turbulent international and regional conditions, including in our immediate neighborhood, prove that our country, which has all the factors needed to achieve a global renaissance, is on the way to achieving the desired objectives, wrote the magazine in its editorial. According to the magazine, these efforts and steps require more than ever before the consolidation of national cohesion and the strengthening of the internal front in order to complete the process of building a new Algeria, strong with its people and its institutions, including its Republican Army, which remains deeply attached to the fulfillment of its constitutional missions in all circumstances and conditions. It pointed out that the new Algeria has also made a strong comeback on the regional and international scenes, reflected in the visits made by the President of the Republic to a number of countries that have deep strategic and fraternal relations with Algeria. These visits reaffirm the return of our country to its natural place in the context of nations, as they are the consecration of tireless and relentless and sustained diplomatic actions and efforts, the results of which have been the recent election of Algeria as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, the magazine maintained. The Minister of Solidarity, Family and the Status of Women, Kautar Kriku, has called for the province of Ain Difla on rural women to contribute alongside the various players to strengthening the mechanisms for safeguarding forests. The ministry said in a press release during a visit to the province. Mrs. Kriku oversaw the launch of a campaign aimed at rural women to raise awareness to the need to preserve and make better use of forests with a view of guaranteeing their long-term survival as an essential source of small-scale income-generating activities. In this respect, she stated that rural women were an important element in the equation for preserving forests from fire and abandonment, according to the press release. Now, the Minister of Higher Education and Scientific Research, Kamal Badari, has presided over the official installation of the commission in charge of drawing up and implementing the action plan for the Nazaha Performance Index in the higher education sector, according to a press release. The installation of the commission, made up of the heads of the central structures concerned and two experts in the field, comes in line with the framework agreement on transparency, prevention and the fight against corruption concluded between the Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research and the High Authority for Transparency, Prevention and Fight Against Corruption. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has ordered the deployment of a standby force to restore constitutional order in Niger, which should be deployed as soon as possible, according to Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara. ECOWAS, which is still hoping for a peaceful resolution of the crisis, has not specified a timetable nor the number of origin of the troops making up the standby force. More details with our colleague Saïd Bourazi.
On Thursday evening, on his return to Abidjan, the Ivorian president declared that heads of state had given the go-ahead for the operation to start as soon as possible. Alassane Ouattara said that Côte d'Ivoire would provide a battalion of 850 to 1,100 men alongside Nigeria and Benin notably, and that other countries would join them. France, for its part, gave its full support to all the conclusions of ECOWAS and reiterated its firm condemnation of the coup attempt underway in Niger, as well as the kidnapping of President Bazoum and his family. The head of the U.S. diplomacy, Antony Blinken, declared that the United States supports the leadership and work of ECOWAS for the return to constitutional order. The West African bloc is not ruling out diplomatic means of reinstating President Bazoum, the elected president overthrown on 26 July and detained ever since. At the end of the Abuja summit, the president of Nigeria, Bola Tinubu, who holds the rotating presidency of ECOWAS, said he hoped to reach a peaceful resolution, adding that the use of force as a last resort could not be ruled out. The president of the ECOWAS Commission, Omar Touray, for his part, reaffirmed the continued commitment to restoring constitutional order through peaceful means. The threat of the use of force was first raised on 30th July at a previous ECOWAS summit. A 7-day ultimatum had been issued to the military in Niamey to reinstate President Bazoum or face armed intervention. But nothing happened when it expired on Sunday.
And the Economic Community of West African State, the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has expressed his full support for the political process undertaken by the UN in Western Sahara during a meeting in Washington with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ahmed Attaf. In a tweet posted at the end of his discussions with Ahmed Attaf, the U.S. Secretary of State announced that he had expressed his full support for the UN political process in Western Sahara. The spokesman for the U.S. State Department, Matt Miller, said that Antony Blinken has reiterated his full support for the efforts of the UN Secretary General's personal envoy, Staffan de Mistura, to reach a political solution in Western Sahara. And to the Middle East file now. In the endless Zionist violence against the defenseless Palestinian people, a Palestinian youth was killed and 4 others were injured by Zionist army gunfire last night in a military raid on Tulkarem refugee camp in the north of the occupied West Bank, according to medical sources. Saïd Bourazi has more details in this report.
Wafa correspondent quoted the sources as saying that Mahmoud Jihad Jarad, 23, was killed after being fatally shot by a live Israeli shot in the chest. 4 others sustained injuries in the abdomen, pelvis, foot, and shoulder, respectively. Jarad was first admitted to nearby Thabet Public Hospital in critical condition before he was announced dead of his wounds, medical sources said. The condition of one of the 4 injured was also described as critical. Elsewhere, Zionist settlers destroyed water pipelines today in the village of Kisan to the east of Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank, according to local sources. Ahmed Ghazel, a local Palestinian activist, told Wafa news agency that a group of Israeli settlers from the Jewish settlement of Ma'ali Inwas broke into Palestinian-owned lands on the outskirts of the village and destroyed drinking water pipelines owned by Hassan Ebayat, a local Palestinian farmer. Zionist settler violence against Palestinians and their property is commonplace across the West Bank and is rarely prosecuted by occupation authorities. On the diplomatic front, Australian Senator Lydia Thorpe has called on the Australian government to recognize the sovereignty of the state of Palestine over the lands illegally occupied by Israel since 1967 and to call for the Israeli government to end the illegal occupation. Senator Thorpe also welcomed the Australian government changing its language this week to recognize the occupation of the state of Palestine as illegal under international law and called on the government to continue on this path to truth. She condemned the violent occupation of Palestine, the brutality of the colonial power that is Israel, and their state-sanctioned murder of the Palestinians.
And finally, 5 Americans detained in Iran have been transferred from prison to house arrest. Their families and the first step in a fragile agreement that could lead to the release of billions of dollars for Tehran. The progress made towards the release of these detainees, one of whom held for nearly 8 years, comes after discreet and intense negotiations between Washington and Tehran, who have been adversaries for decades. The next stage in an agreement, according to a source close to the negotiations, could be the transfer of $6 billion of Iranian funds frozen in South Korea to a special account in Qatar. Iran could use this money for humanitarian purchases such as food and medicines. And with this, we come to the end of this news bulletin. Time now for a weekly program, starting with my colleague Jamal Silmani with a program on tourism, and it will be followed by another program on culture by my colleague Asia Bakar. As for me, I'll meet you again tomorrow for a fresh edition of our news bulletin in English. Until then, stay tuned to Radio Algeria International, and bye-bye for now.
Islam has already spread into northern Africa by the mid-7th century, only a few decades after the Prophet Muhammad moved with his followers from Mecca to Medina on the neighboring Arabian Peninsula. The Arab conquest of Spain and the push of Arab armies as far as the Indus River culminated in an empire that stretched over 3 continents a mere 100 years after the Prophet's death. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, Arab traders and travelers, then African clerics, began to spread their religion along the eastern coast of Africa and to the western and central Sudan, literally land of black people, stimulating the development of urban communities. Given its negotiated, practical approach to different cultural situations, it is perhaps more appropriate to consider Islam in Africa in terms of its multiple histories rather than as a unified movement. The first converts were the Sudanese merchants, followed by a few rulers and courtiers, Ghana in the 11th century and Mali in the 13th century. The masses of rural peasants, however, remained little touched. In the 11th century, the Almoravid intervention, led by a group of Berber nomads who were strict observers of Islamic law, gave the conversion process a new momentum in the Ghana Empire and beyond. The spread of Islam throughout the African continent was neither simultaneous nor uniform, but followed a gradual and adaptive path. Islamic political and aesthetic influences on African societies remain difficult to assess. In some capital cities, such as Ghana and Gao, the presence of Muslim merchants resulted in the establishment of mosques. The Malian king Mansa Musa brought back from a pilgrimage to Mecca the architect As-Sahili, who is often credited with the creation of the Sudano-Sahelian building style. Musa's brother, Mansa Suleiman, followed his path and encouraged the building of mosques, as well as the development of Islamic learning. Islam brought to Africa the art of writing and new techniques of weighting. The city of Timbuktu, for instance, flourished as a commercial and intellectual center, seemingly undisturbed by various upheavals. Timbuktu began as a Tuareg settlement, was soon integrated into the Mali Empire, then was reclaimed by the Tuareg, and finally incorporated into the Songhai Empire. In the 16th century, the majority of Muslim scholars in Timbuktu were of Sudanese origin. On the continent's eastern coast, Arabic vocabulary was absorbed into the Bantu languages from the Swahili language. On the other hand, in many cases, conversion for sub-Saharan Africans was probably a way to protect themselves against being sold into slavery, a flourishing trade between Lake Chad and the Mediterranean. For their rulers, who were not active proselytizers, conversion remained somewhat formal, a gesture perhaps aimed at gaining political support from the Arabs and facilitating commercial relationships. The strongest resistance to Islam seems to have emanated from the Mossi and the Bamana, with the development of the Segu kingdom. Eventually, sub-Saharan Africans developed their own brand of Islam, often referred to as African Islam, with specific brotherhoods and practices. Because of its resistance to the representation of people and animals, the nature of Islam's interaction with the visual arts in Africa was one in which Islamic forms were accommodated and adapted. Muslim clerics' literacy and esoteric powers drew scores of converts to Islam. Sub-Saharan Muslim clerics, known as marabouts, began fabricating amulets with Quranic verses, which came to displace indigenous talismans and medical packets. These amulets are featured in the design of many traditional African artifacts. Islam also reinforced the African fondness for geometric design and their reputation of patterns in decorating the surface of textiles and crafted projects. Local weaving may have been transformed with the importation of North African weaving techniques. Islam has also often existed side by side with representational traditions such as masquerading. Such practices have often been viewed as supplemental rather than oppositional to Islam, particularly when they are seen as effective or operating outside of the central concerns of the faith. An early example of this was noted by Ibn Battuta, the Maghribi scholar who visited Mali in 1352-1353 and witnessed a masquerade performance at the royal court of its Muslim king. In many areas of Africa, the coexistence of Islam with representational armed forms continues today. But although Islam has influenced a wide range of artistic practices in Africa since its introduction, monumental architecture is the best preserved legacy of its early history on the continent. Mosques are the most important architectural examples of the tremendous aesthetic diversity generated by the interaction between African peoples and Islamic faith.
Dear listeners, and welcome on our waves. Today we'll talk about bouqalat, a tradition that is so popular among women in Algiers. What is bouqala? Let's know together. Bouqala is a short poem which somehow predicts the future of the person. Generally, it comprises 4 to 6 verses. It was transmitted from generation to generation orally. It can tell of a good thing that may happen to us, as it can foresee the opposite. Algerian women used to gather, and many still do today during the evenings of the holy month of Ramadan, to read bouqalat for each other around traditional sweets and nuts, accompanied by sherbet drink or the Algerian mint tea. How is it played? Well, in the evening of Ramadan, when the glow of the moon and stars replaces that of the sun, and after iftar or the evening meal eaten by Muslims after the sun goes down, women in Algiers gather to talk and have a good time while playing bouqalet. Bouqala in origin means a pot made of clay in the shape of a white cup. This container is the main object of the bouqalet game. Women used to bring this pot, fill it with water, and put a silver jewel inside, notably a ring or a bracelet. Then the pot is passed to the women wishing to participate in the game, so that each of them puts her own bean to identify it during the draw. Finally, the pot is covered with a young girl's shashia or traditional hat. The hat should smell of the incense of benzoin, henna, olive oil, and small pieces of wood taken from 7 different doors. Before starting the bouqalet game, you have to say this sentence: "In the name of Allah I start. God's peace and blessings be upon His Prophet."
عطير الأنفاس اسقيني نشرب.
Before each bouqala recitation, each woman ties her handkerchief, scarf, or even her belt, thinking of the one to whom she dedicates the bouqala and listens attentively to the recitation. As soon as the game ends, a young woman randomly removes a bean from the container, thus revealing the woman concerned by the bouqala or the short poem, and all others interpret the short poem as they understand it. Then the bean is put back in the container and the operation is repeated several times. If a woman wants to see in the dream if her wish will come true, she puts a sip of the pot's water in her mouth, which she spits out after mouthing her wish. And she gets the answer in the form of signs in her dreams. That's what the tradition says.
الكساوي متعندات لبسوا موتهم من قفاط عن كل لوان البرمود ديدي والطلس والشكرنط المسجر والقلب حجر والمبر وبالكاد والغول الشيبي وخريب الكيوس.
Of course, all these steps were not amassed, and the tradition of the bouqalet differed from one neighborhood to the other. And with time, the majority of women who play the game of bouqalet found a lot of superstition in the rules of the game and escaped most of them by just putting the poems inside a pot and picking one bouqala blindly.
دبلج مترصعين بالجوهر والعقيان يوم الجمعة خرجوا الريام باش تفاس البالي سربات يحيروا العقل يوم الجمعة خرجوا الريام.
Poems and being able to recall and read poems was a skill that was appreciated and celebrated in old Algiers. The bouqala game still exists today, but in a less formal way. And nowadays, Algerians in wedding ceremonies wrap the bouqala with the sweets and cakes offered to the guests. The bouqala tradition is still appreciated for being both mysterious and poetic.
وخرج حراس الريم قال لي واش عنا بك يا مغربي انتقت انا قلت ليه انا قضيت البلاد جيت نستبرك منك يا حكيم.
Coming to the end of today's cultural broadcast, let's tie a handkerchief or scarf and listen to this bouqala read by Algerian actress Aida Akshoud. The bouqala says, I went to the beach and found the sand boiling with heat. I took a handful of sand and put it on my lap. Then an angel told me, God will open his doors for you, and the one you are thinking of will come to you safe and